Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to the Institute. I'm going to talk for around 45 minutes. We'll then take a very short break, and then I hope we'll have lots of discussion. So if you think of things as I talk, hold it, and there'll be plenty of time to explore afterwards. I am going to show some slides, and just before I do that, I'm going to be looking at the feminine in Jung in a sort of different way, a much more collective and 21st century way. I'm going to relate it to ideas of heroism. I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to abolish the hero myth, and I'm going to introduce the novel and talk about why a pre-Christian mythical pattern seems rich today to look at the feminine that we need in the 21st century. So, just sharing my screen. Okay, and go away. Now, very good with this. Okay. So, okay, here we are. And so you may recognize these two here. What you should be able to see is Oedipus speaking to the Sphinx. And this really brings us to the fundamental difference between Jung and Freud on gender. Freud, as we know, took the Oedipus myth very seriously, and he felt that Oedipus's fatal mistakes of killing his father and ending up married to his mother, that this was very fundamental to how individuation, although of course he didn't call it that, but how consciousness began in the psyche of a man. Jung did not agree that this was so paramount, and he kind of rolled the Oedipus myth back to the moment when Oedipus talks to the Sphinx. And whereas Freud thought that Oedipus solved the riddle of the Sphinx, Jung thought that Oedipus made a fatal mistake. And in coming up with a rational solution to the riddle, Oedipus had missed something about the Sphinx, that she represented what later Freudians came to call the pre-Oedipal mother, that the Sphinx was this manifestation of the unconscious, which could not be conquered with rationality. And in a way, this is the theme of my talk this evening, that the Jungian unconscious cannot be conquered with rationality, and that coding that rationality as masculine, as Freud does, leads to all sorts of problems. So we get Jung, and when we talk about the feminine in Jung, we tend to kind of just sort of go into the anima. And I want to come at the feminine in Jung slightly differently, that there is in Jung a generative feminine that is often overlooked, that the great mother archetype is present in Jung. He writes about it, of course, in relationship to the mother archetype, but more importantly, he manifests the great mother archetype when he talks about synchronicity. That when he writes about synchronicity, when he writes about discovering synchronicity, he says that his idea of synchronicity allows nature to reveal more of herself. And really, without stressing the point, he's talking about nature as a kind of source of divine creativity, that he's talking about the goddess. The goddess that is a form of the pre-Oedipal mother, if you want to look at it psychoanalytically, the goddess that is the pre-Christian goddess, if you want to look at it historically. Another factor in Jung's feminine is the trickster. Now, of course, the trickster we don't think of as feminine in Jung. Jung writes about the trickster a lot, and he writes about the trickster as mainly masculine. However, the trickster is not male. Jung actually says, even the trickster's sex is optional, despite its phallic qualities. He can turn himself into a woman and bear children. This is a reference to his original nature as a creator, for the world is made from the body of a god. So what we've really got here is another version of the goddess, this idea of a kind of generative nature at the base of things that isn't fixed as to gender and is definitely not exclusively male. Not the kind of typical idea of God. And Jung talks about the trickster very often in alchemy as Mercurius, and you can read the alchemy books and you can completely get the impression that the trickster is Mercurius is male. Every so often he has to stop and say, well, the trickster isn't really, male like that, because Mercurius can have a feminine form as Melusine. Mercurius, at certain points in the alchemical process, is the Virgin Mary. So we're talking about an androgyny of the archetypal psyche. And what a lot of this amounts to is what I feel is Jung's underlying project, that Jung has a kind of big cultural project, and it is to restore the feminine to modernity. And he is a conservative with revolutionary ideas. I think Jung, the person, didn't really want society to change. He didn't really want women to be taking on professional roles. He'd be quite happy for everything to stay as it was. But when it came to the psyche, he knew that modernity was sick because it had either marginalized or rejected so much that was considered feminine. And in fact, the term feminine was used to reject things like the unconscious, like nature, like the body. And that a relationship with the unconscious and nature and the body had to be restored if the psyche of modernity was to be saved. Now, Jung being the conservative, he really wanted to save men. So he tended to think about restoring the feminine for men. He wasn't really concerned about the roles of women. So we have a problem with Jung's feminine, but we also have this huge project, which has started to happen if we think about the 20th century moving into the 21st. But of course, in many ways, it's only just started and so much more needs to be done. So let's see if we can move this along. So, for example, the climate emergency. And you can see a photograph of a burning forest here. And this is Jung on synchronicity. Experiment makes conditions, imposes them on nature, and this way forces her to give an answer to a question devised by man. She is prevented from answering out of the fullness of her possibilities. But what synchronicity tells us is that when we look at this burning forest, we are looking at ourselves, that this is us. That there isn't a division between the burning forest and the wounds in the psyche. And these are largely self-inflicted wounds. In destroying nature, we are destroying ourselves. Jung talks about nature being prevented by science from answering out of her fullness. Well, the climate emergency is nature getting our attention. Nature is answering us and has been forced by the centuries of exploitation and repression to answer us via the climate emergency. That is a shadow form of nature talking back. So in the Jungian project, we have the return of the goddess. And it looks a bit like this. So evolution, climate change, evolution. It's not often realized that evolution is a goddess. When we say that everything is produced by the earth, and the earth's generativity and creativity and producing mutations and changes and whatever, that is a secular way of the old goddess myth, where the earth, the physical earth, is the divine goddess. Today, we talk about evolution in terms of complexity theory, and as many Jungians have suggested, complexity theory is very close to Jung's idea of how the complexity of the psyche generates new things. So evolution, the idea of evolution is a return of the goddess. Climate change and its unknowns is a return of the goddess, because we are forced to recognize that we are not in control of nature. We've never been in control of nature, and that we depend on nature in a way that we've failed to have consciousness of our innate relationship to nature. So we also find, of course, that nature is feminine in patriarchal binaries. And we see this nature, we see that patriarchy, the rule of the father, generated a whole series of binaries. So there was rule of the father, which meant that the masculine is in the image of God, the feminine is not in the image of God. So you get these binaries between binaries that are also in a hierarchy. Masculine is superior to feminine. Feminine is nature. The masculine is God. Similarly, nature is feminine and culture is masculine, and so on and so forth. Mind and body, all of these binaries are often seen through gender. So we have that binary, but we also have that nature is feminine in the pre-Oedipal mother. And that is something that has become quite important to post-Freudian theory. And the climate emergency means that we are no longer in patriarchy, even if we do not acknowledge it, because in the climate emergency, there is no father who is capable of assuming control. And patriarchy is about rule of the father. It's about the ability to control. And we can't control the climate. We've acted as if we could, and now we can't. So I want to pay tribute to The Myth of the Goddess by Anne Baring and Jules Cashford. At the end of that wonderful book, they talk about two mythical patterns. One they call the Earth Mother, which is related to the pre-patriarchal, prehistory goddess of the ancient peoples, and one they call the Sky Father, which is the patriarchal, dualistic binary system that has structured so much of modernity. And their point is that both these mythic systems are necessary to consciousness, because the Earth Mother is a structure of consciousness via relating, and Sky Father is a structure of consciousness via separating. And we need relating and separating. And the problem comes when one of these pushes the other out or diminishes the other so that there is no balance. Western modernity has been formed through the dominance of Sky Father separating, and that's why, and Jung kind of perceived this, we need Earth Mother relating, and we need it in the form of the feminine, because we've spent patriarchal centuries calling things we don't like the feminine, or calling things that the dominant culture doesn't like. Okay, so Jung's project of restoring the feminine. So we have individuation, which is, of course, a form of restoring by connecting to the parts of the psyche that our culture has either forced us to disconnect from, or encouraged us to disconnect from, or never encouraged us to connect to. We tell a different story of who we are. Restoring is restoring, and in many ways, Jung saw this as happening through gender. And we know that Jung was an essentialist. He believed that men and women were innately different, and that psychic health required connecting to the other gender in the unconscious. And that's okay, but it's totally inadequate and just not where we understand gender today. It's also incoherent, because in saying that in order to be truly ourselves, we have to connect to the other gender, he is actually arguing for a fluid gender in the psyche. And you really can't have essentialism and fluid gender. He's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to keep the social norms that he is comfortable with, which place him in a very fortunate position, but he is acknowledging in the psychology that gender isn't fixed in an essentialist way, that it must be fluid, and without that fluidity, there is no psychic health. So obviously, he writes endlessly about how the anima is the soul in the male psyche. And this is incoherent when he insists that men have a soul and women just have the animus, and he's incredibly negative about the animus. And one of the ways of understanding what he's doing is to bring in a bit of Jacques Lacan, to say that in Jungian ideas, the anima is phallic. Lacan says that in Freudian theory, the penis becomes the phallus, which is the sign of masculinity, and also a sign that has power, that has ordering, that is implicitly patriarchal. But because of the way the psyche is split from the mother, men don't have the phallus. What they have a sort of implicit connection to the phallus, but they require that women be the phallus for them, which basically means it's an explanation of heterosexuality from the man's point of view, that men have immense desires for what they've lost. They've lost the fullness that they had in the mother's womb, and they never get it back. They're always experiencing this loss, but a woman can give them a sense of that fullness in sexuality. And in that sense, the woman is impersonating the sign of power that will give the man access to power. This is really what Jung is doing with the anima, because the anima is what the man desires, and the woman has to impersonate the man's anima. And that explains heterosexuality for Jung. And we can see that this has a certain logic to it, but it's also no good. It's no good to say that women are supposed to be the objects of male desire. It doesn't at all account for same-sex love. It doesn't at all account for men and women not being polar opposites. It doesn't account for the way gender is different in different societies. And other parts of Jung are closer to acknowledging this than much of the writing on the anima. But we'll move on. We can discuss this later. So, despite and because of Jung, we have had 100 years of things changing around the feminine, and improvements in the possibilities for women. That there has been political improvements, and there's also been political attempts to put women back in a box, and we can discuss examples of that. So what's happening here? Yeah. And Jung, of course, was very excited by the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. He saw this as restoring the feminine in Christianity. This was the religious structure that he was interested in restoring for his world. We see suffrage, we see professions, women being able to vote, women being able to take up professions. We have advances in spiritual leadership, but also patriarchal iconography largely there. So I want to just say a quick word about this image on the left of the screen. This is the image of the triple goddess. And as you can see, it's a moon goddess. The moon goddess is the sickle moon, the growing moon. This is the maiden. The full moon is the mother, and the sickle moon, as the moon is fading away, that is the crone. So we have maiden, mother, and crone understood as the phases of the moon. This is a very it's very immanent and generative feminine, because the moon goes through these phases every month. So the god is there as a child, the god is there as an adult, the god is there as an aged person, then the god is gone, and then the god comes back again as the child. So it's very much about, you could say it's about embodiment, it's about death and rebirth, as opposed to the more transcendent patriarchal understanding of the Christian Trinity. And of course, it was considered in many societies that the moon's phases related to the bodies of women, that female menstruation follows moon patterns. So hang on to this image, because we're going to move on to the idea of the hero, and we're going to take a little look at an incident in the war this year in Ukraine. So people talk to me at Pacifica about the hero myth or the hero's journey. And it took me a long time to realize what they were talking about. And it's a problem. It is a peculiarly American problem. No one talks about the hero myth outside of the United States, outside of depth psychology and mythical circles in the United States. And it seems to me that this hero myth thing is caught up in patriarchal modernity in a very American fashion. And that's what I'm going to say a little bit about. And I want to introduce it by looking at a heroic episode in the Ukraine war. And you'll know it because it went viral. And it happened in the first 24 hours of the invasion. And it's the small group of soldiers on the island who are defending Ukraine, and a Russian warship comes by. So it was called Snake Island in the Black Sea. And this is the audio translated into English. So the Russians come by in a Russian warship, and this is what they say. This is a Russian warship. I propose you lay down arms and surrender to avoid bloodshed and unnecessary victims. Otherwise, you will be bombed. So, Russian warship bristling with guns and a small group of soldiers with minimal firearms. And there's a pause, and then they reply. Russian warship, go fuck yourself. And at that moment, the Russian warship opens fire. And for several weeks, it was believed that they killed all the soldiers. In fact, some of them did survive, and that's a very good thing. But this was this had an enormous effect on the Ukrainian public, so much so that while the war is going on, the Ukrainian post office held a competition to design an image for this event. And this is the image. And it's worth having a look at this, because this is not the hero myth. It's clearly martial. What we see here is a soldier, but he's got his back to us. He's holding a finger up to the Russian warship. We have a confrontation between something that's recognizably human, even if fully battle dress, and something that isn't human. It's a big warship. We don't see the Russians as people. We see technology and war. The impossibility that these soldiers could win against a warship. The vulnerability. He's got a gun, but he's pointing it at the ground. The gun isn't going to work. All they've got is that little finger. And of course, you can see that there is a stark border here between land, and notice the land doesn't look terribly healthy, and the sea with the grey battleship on the sea. So this was taken as heroic by the Ukrainians and many other people who commented on this incident. It is nothing like the hero myth. What happens here is that a small group of people, knowing that they're not going to win, they're not going to triumph, but they're also not going to submit to an aggressor who is coming to take over their land and terrorize their families. Very much not the hero myth, because there is no chance of success. There is no chance of triumphing. There is only, do you surrender or do you say, go fuck yourself? Do you defy, knowing that it will encourage them to shoot at you? Okay, moving on. This is the so-called hero's journey. And you can see it's a circle. And here are the stages, the call to adventure, finding an assistant, trials, approach, crisis, finding treasure, the result, the return, the new life, resolution, the status quo. And that there are these two worlds. The hero's journey has been boiled down from Joseph Campbell's hero's myth. On the left, you see a typical example of how the hero's journey is expressed. We see a hero on a horse, all fancy dressed up. He's dominating one animal and he's about to kill another who looks quite dangerous. But the hero doesn't look in any real danger himself. He looks rather pleased with himself and he's clearly going to triumph. So the origin of the hero's journey is Joseph Campbell's monomyth. And you can see it's a little bit more complex, but it's very similar to the simple version. And Campbell never referred to this as the hero's journey, I'm told by Campbell scholars. What he did was he read a whole load of myths and he decided that there were common elements, and he took the common elements from the myths and he put them together to make this structure. And Call to Adventure, etc., Belly of the Whale, Meeting with the Goddess, Woman as Temptress, etc., etc. On you go. And there are things that bug me here are, well, Woman as Temptress in particular, and Master of Two Worlds. But what really bugs me is that Joseph Campbell considered this to be an important structure for a man, that the hero myth is about the formation of the ego in a man, and a man, not a woman. This is not something that women can do. He was very clear and far more essentialist than Jung. This is for men only, and men are supposed to be heroes who find women as temptresses and who end up as the master of two worlds. So this is an idea of hero that is very gendered as masculine, and it's very much about a single figure, and it's about mastery. And in my view, this has kind of locked into various issues in American history and culture and politics, and resulted in this country being stuck. So moving on, the problem with the monomyth is it's not about building the ego, it is about building a certain kind of ego. And it's a hard ego, an ego that is about mastery and separation, not for a relational form of individuation. This is about modeling a man on the singular and the dominant. And it's essentialist. Various people have tried to fill in the gap here by writing of a heroine's journey. And whereas Campbell says the hero myth is for men, the heroine's journey is for women. No, that's not a solution. That's not how myths and gender work. And the crucial thing is that it's not a myth. The hero myth is not a myth, because a myth has psychic validity because it has arisen in a particular time and place and location and culture. A myth is a real psychic event. This is not a myth. It's an idea about myths. It's extracted from real myths. And it's not a myth, and that is why it has been toxic. That's why it has reinforced toxic masculinity. And one of the ways we can see this is that the hero myth works for Putin more than it works for Zelensky. And I don't want to spend too much time, but we could talk about that. Now, if we look at actual heroes in actual stories or actual myths, we have Jesus, Jason, Theseus, Odysseus, Oedipus, Persephone, Ariadne, and Antigone, and many others, and none of them are simply do the hero myth. Most of these experience catastrophic defeat. Many of these are involved in their own communities. They are saving their family. They are saving their community. They are trying to deal with a terrible problem in their own backyard. And when we look at the hero myth, we can see that it is making us stuck. Jung said, "I am stuck" is the theme of fairy tale and myth, and it is what everybody says when they come into analysis. And that's a brilliant realization. But he didn't mean that fairy tales and myths teach us to be stuck. Rather, they teach us how to get over the stuckness. And Black Lives Matter is an example of the American psyche being stuck, so that something that happened hundreds of years ago when plantation slaves ran away is still happening with police forces today. That Me Too is a kind of psychic stuckness around sexuality and men and women. Climate, gun control, the death penalty, healthcare plans that are neither healthy, caring, nor a plan. There's a lot of stuckness. So my work has been, over the years, many years, to reimagine the hero as collective and feminine. This does not mean that this feminine collective hero cannot be embodied by men. We are in a world of fluid gender, of fluid sexualities, of trans possibilities. And the collective and feminine hero is something that men can and do. I think Zelensky, for example, is a collective and feminine hero. But in order to sort of explore this, I am using female characters. So going back to that mythic pattern that does exist in a number of pre-Christian cultures, the mother, the crone, and the maiden, what I've been trying to do for the past 7 years is take that myth and reimagine it as a way of looking at marginalized, flawed women, women who are never considered heroic by the way they look or where they are in society. So I've got in my novels a detective hero who is in fact 3 women working together: a crone, an older woman who is marginalized on grounds of her age and because she's lost her job, a mother figure who has been marginalized because she has a chronic mental illness, and a maiden who is a maiden not because she's never had sex, but because she's never experienced love. She is a trafficked woman. And I felt for a long time that the trafficked woman has to be reimagined as a hero, that the trafficked woman stands for so much that has been oppressed in our world. So I've been kind of haunted by this trafficked woman. And I want to just bring in James Hillman's 4 pillars that he writes about in Revisioning Psychology. And he says that we need to be thinking of the psyche through 4 very dynamic possibilities: personifying, pathologizing, psychologizing, dehumanizing. And in my my story, my novel writing, my art, I'm doing those things. So I'm personifying this collective feminine hero as a crone, a mother, and a maiden. And they have names. The crone is Mary Wandwalker, the mother is Caroline Jones, and the maiden is Anna Vronsky. Pathologizing, what's the bad stuff? Well, the bad stuff is that the climate emergency is affecting us all. Things like post-traumatic stress disorder affect all sorts of people. And the novel, The Sacred Well Murders, includes an army veteran who has post-traumatic stress disorder. It includes the result of family breakdown due to hard drugs, and it includes human trafficking. Psychologizing, the struggle between literalizing possession and concretizing in soul making and individuation. That sounds a bit confusing, but basically the Sacred Well Murders contrasts individuation and possession. And there is embracing myth as something that individuates, and there is also becoming possessed. And we can look at the world today, and we can see a lot of examples of possession in our political and even military problems. And dehumanizing. The genre of mystery fiction, detective fiction, brings the Grail quest into the 21st century, and that we will look at briefly. Oh, come on, that's right. So one of the things I've come to realize is that literary genres, art genres have archetypes and they have myths. And one of the myths in detective fiction is the Grail quest, because the detective is on a quest for the Grail. The Grail is the truth that heals the wasteland. And in order to find the Grail, the detective, the knight, has to ask the right questions. And this is also the story of the Jungian analyst. The analyst also is on a quest to heal the wasteland of the patient's psyche, to find the truth, the collective chalice that will contain the wounded psyche of the patient. So the fictional detective and the analyst, they are very similar mythic figures. So both analysis and detective fiction reenacts the Grail myth. The analyst and the detective is a knight on a quest, and there is absolutely no reason that knight cannot be a woman. Both the analyst and the detective has to learn about the right questions. They are seeking the lost feminine, the Grail or cup, and they need to do that to restore the wasteland. And we notice that the Grail Knight is not the hero myth. The Grail Knight is not conquering, is not going to be the master of two worlds. There is a lot of fuss about Galahad's virginity, but I would suggest that Galahad's virginity is purity of purpose, and that is something that analysts have as well as detectives, because they both share a crucial archetypal characteristic of integrity. They are individuated and undivided. So there is also the myth behind the myth. And the myth behind the Grail myth is the Celtic myth of the Well Maidens of Logres. And this is something that became important in writing The Sacred Well Murders, that is a story about 21st century people wanting to become ancient Celts. And this Celtic story is about wells, sacred wells, because the Celts felt that fresh water was sacred, freshwater sources were sacred. And we know this because they put offerings, and we have found offerings in lakes and rivers and wells in the Celtic lands of Europe. So the Well Maidens in the story guard the water sources, which are the portals between this physical world and the other world. And the Well Maidens are guarding the sources, and when people come along, the Well Maiden will come out, take a special cup, dip it in the water and offer it to the traveller. And all of this is fine, and it means that the land is healthy because the wells flow and they water the land, and the land is fertile. However, one day a king rides by with his men, and the Well Maiden comes out, takes the cup, offers the water to the king, but instead of accepting the water graciously, the king rapes the maiden. And seeing this, his men think, oh, good idea. They ride out to all the other wells and they rape all the other maidens. And as a result of that, the wells dry up and the land goes to waste. And we can certainly see this as a story about the psyche and the conduit between the conscious and the unconscious, and the necessity of that conduit, and violence and dominance being not the way to do it. So the rape of the Well Maidens, a very ancient story, does seem to be saying something about the suppression of the feminine, the split from the unconscious, and the rape of nature. And we end up with a wasteland of psyche and nature. So here is a hero. This is actually an actor who played Miss Marple for many years on British TV. Joan Hickson is her name. This is the crone hero, and the Miss Marple stories are very much about an elderly woman who is despised by the culture, but who actually goes around saving and rescuing and finding out the truth, but never in a dominating way. Here is another figure of a detective. This is the cover of a book by Diane Mock Davidson, whose detective is a cook and an abused woman. She is the Hestia as a detective. These archetypal patterns are unmarried or not exactly married goddesses. She is the goddess of the hearth and the home. She detects in order to make or recreate or protect the hearth, the home, the family. And so here we have a hero, a detective as guardian. And James Hillman pointed out that Hestia was the goddess of interiority. Another detecting goddess is Artemis, who is the incarnation of the feminine, of wild purity, but also the feminine as hunter. Artemis is a famous hunter, and also a protector of young women and women in childbirth. And V.I. Wachowski, you can see here, is very much a protector of women in the stories about her. She's also a bringer of death. Aphrodite can be a hero and a detective as well. There are many heroic stories by women that include the pleasures of the body and knowing through the body and knowing through eros. And of course, we can have Athena. Miss Marple is very much an Athena detective. These are two other actors playing Miss Marple. She is the guardian of the city. She is a strategist. She works within patriarchy. She contains the Furies. And in doing so, she is the chalice, the container. Again, not at all the so-called hero myth. So we come to my attempt to reconfigure the idea of the hero as collective and feminine in the Sacred Well murders. So rather than just one detective, I have three, and the three women need each other. They're very poor detectives. They're not very well, they're not trained. They mean well, they make a lot of mistakes, but only by relating, by coming together, can they possibly succeed, and can they possibly start healing the wasteland around them. They are particularly marginalized women. As I said, the trafficked woman, someone with a chronic mental illness. Caroline has chronic clinical depression, and the crone, the older woman who has been discarded by the patriarchy. The murderers in the book want to restore, want to bring back the Sacred Well, but they're going about it the wrong way. They are literalizing the myth, and rather than actually restoring the feminine, they are drawn into violent acts, repeating the rape of the Well Maidens. And really, the theme of the book is those who do not individuate their gods become possessed by them. So this is where we've got to, that I wrote the novel as an act of Jungian arts-based research. I used Jungian ideas and practices as part of writing the novel, as part of working with the characters and the plot. Jungian arts-based research is doing therapy with the collective. It is a new paradigm, a new kind of research beyond qualitative research and traditional scientific research. That this practice, Jungian arts-based research, is multicultural and transpersonal. It includes the body, tacit knowing, the unconscious, imagination, synchronicity, and it uses these to make knowledge. It is transformational, critical activist, hero in the feminine, and it is alchemical. So there were synchronicities when I was writing the book. One of them, you'll notice this says synchronicity and Bridget. Well, I was offered a choice of publication dates for the novel, and I chose the 1st of February. And only after choosing that did I discover that 1st of February is the celebration of the Celtic goddess Bridget, who is a goddess of sacred wells. And I had no idea before I made that decision that was the case. So there's a further step here, which I don't have time to explain, but it is the idea that this is transdisciplinary, and I'd be happy to talk about that. And what this means is that this kind of Jungian work deals with multiple realities that embrace indigenous knowing in a network, not a hierarchy, that use complexity and the logic of the included middle, the Jungian symbol. That this is transhuman, transcultural, Hillman's dehumanizing, Holy Grail, ecocentric hero in the feminine. And I think that's probably enough from me. So I'm going to stop sharing and right.